Trump 2.0 officially released his national security strategy, outlining the new phase of national security guidelines and policy direction. In the days following the release of his report, almost everyone who read those 33 pages believed that the global landscape had already undergone a profound upheaval and that the future would bring tremendous transformation. Although the U.S. president's term is 4 years, many people still adopt an AQ-like mentality, even comforting themselves with an ostrich attitude, thinking that no one can predict what the situation will be like after 4 years. Alright, but let's put aside for now what might happen in 4 years. Keep in mind that Trump has been in office for less than a year, and within this brief year, the entire world has already undergone drastic change. From Trump 1.0 to 2.0, it can be seen that the strategic framework he established during the 1.0 period has basically remained unaltered and unbroken even after Biden took office. In contrast, after Trump entered the 2.0 stage, his new national security strategy became even more crucial, deserving careful, word-by-word reading and thorough understanding by everyone. Because every single word in it must be carefully studied and thoroughly verified by China, now a major world power, and absolutely must not be overlooked. Alright, after a few days, the whole world had generally begun to look for and develop strategies to respond. Then I would like to ask you an important question, which is about the contents of this National Security Strategy version 2.0. First, what was your initial reaction after seeing this document? Second, how will various parties respond to this National Security Strategy, NSS? Next, this National Security Strategy report consists of 29 pages, with a dedicated section from pages 19 to 24 focusing on issues related to China. So, in the content from page 19 to page 24, what is mainly discussed from the middle of page 23 to halfway through page 24? It mainly discusses issues related to Taiwan. From this, we can see that if we do not analyze the issues of China and Taiwan separately in this security report, overall we will find that the report divides the world into several different regions. To put it simply, this is a hybrid strategy. So what exactly is a so-called hybrid security strategy? In Europe, the United States has adopted what is known as a policy of strategic contraction. In other words, the U.S. seeks to minimize its direct interference in European affairs. Regarding NATO, which is led by Europe, the U.S. no longer shoulders the sole primary responsibility, but instead asks European countries to share a greater portion of the obligations and responsibilities. At the same time, the United States opposed increasing its own security burden. To achieve this goal, it adopted a strategy of preventing NATO from further expansion and demonstrated a willingness to coexist peacefully with Russia. This part pertains to the European dimension and is therefore called strategic contraction. This policy echoes the viewpoint emphasized at the beginning of the report, that the United States should not meddle or intervene in everything around the world, nor should it bear the costs for all international problems. The era when America shouldered global responsibilities has come to an end. Therefore, this strategic contraction echoes the principle set out at the beginning of the report, the primacy of America's core interests. Only matters related to U.S. interests are worth engaging in. If unrelated to those interests, the United States should not get involved. Next, regarding the Western Hemisphere, he specifically mentioned this region at the very beginning. In short, this signifies a revival of the Monroe Doctrine, clearly stating that the affairs of the Americas are not to be interfered with by any other country. America's affairs should be decided by America itself, and even in matters involving other countries, the will and position of the United States should serve as the ultimate guiding force. Therefore, this also became the justification for its recent actions in Venezuela and Honduras. In the case of Venezuela, the United States even resorted directly to military intimidation to achieve its policy objectives. In the case of Honduras, he exerted pressure through verbal warnings, clearly stating that no presidential candidate with an anti-American stance could be elected. The result indeed had a certain effect, and this was precisely the situation he had hoped to see. He sought to completely shift the presidential forces, which had originally shown many leftist and anti-American tendencies, into a pro-American camp. At the same time, This also served as a clear and direct message to China and Russia. Do not interfere in Central and South American affairs, as this is within the sphere of U.S. influence. At the same time, he called on all allied nations, particularly Canada, Mexico, as well as Japan and South Korea, to join forces in countering China's trade surplus, urging China to shift from a country that has long maintained a trade surplus to an economy driven primarily by domestic demand. This is one of the core patterns of his thinking. Therefore, strategic expansion was adopted in Central and South America, while in Europe there was a strategic contraction, forming a sharp and distinct contrast between the two. As for the remaining Middle East and Asia, these two regions are designated as strategic competition areas, with neither clear plans for expansion nor any intention to contract. As for the section concerning China, as I mentioned earlier, the report devotes its most extensive analysis to this topic, with the content specifically discussing China occupying pages 19 through 24. As for the other China-related sections, they mainly focus on economic and technological issues, covering content of a more general and principled nature, perspectives that are, in fact, already very familiar to everyone. Among the issues that are particularly sensitive in China, the most prominent one is the Taiwan question. As for the section on the Taiwan issue, what exactly is its title? Its title is Deterring Military Threats, meaning deterring military threats or preventing the occurrence of military threats. In other words, he believes that China poses a military threat to the Asia-Pacific region, especially toward Taiwan. However, does the United States not pose a military threat to Latin America? In his view, that is not classified as a military threat. Therefore, I cannot help but say that in this report, the starkly different ways of discussing itself and other countries inevitably make one question why such an obvious double standard is being displayed. Because in Latin America, the United States' military pressure on other countries is not seen as a threat, but in Asia, if China exerts influence on the United States and its allies, it is immediately defined as a military threat. Therefore, the title of this report is intended to deter military threats, and the military threats it refers to mainly revolve around issues related to Taiwan. Therefore, he regards Taiwan as the region most likely to experience a military conflict. Some people also point out that the significance of this report should not be overlooked, as it mentions Taiwan as many as 8 times. However, these 8 mentions of Taiwan are mainly concentrated in the relevant statements made during the latter half of 2023 and throughout 2024. As for the sections of the report that mention Taiwan, most of the content is not particularly positive, focusing mainly on describing the military threat posed by mainland China to Taiwan and how the United States seeks to contain it. Of course, at first glance it may seem like a friendly stance toward Taiwan, but a closer examination reveals otherwise. He emphasized that all attention should be focused on Taiwan. In the second sentence of the second paragraph, it was stated more explicitly that this is because Taiwan holds an extremely advantageous position in the field of semiconductor production. At the same time, Taiwan is also regarded as a key passage that gives China the opportunity to reach the second island chain, a point stated quite explicitly in the report. In addition, Taiwan's geographical location happens to separate Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia into 2 distinct strategic theaters. He explicitly and directly used the term theaters, and here, theaters refers precisely to the meaning of war zones. Taiwan's geographic location happens to lie between the first and second island chains, making it the most critical stronghold for preventing the PLA from entering the second island chain. In addition, the area north of Taiwan is referred to as Northeast Asia, while the area south of Taiwan belongs to Southeast Asia. Such a division actually splits the region into 2 separate theaters of war. It is noteworthy that the term he used is theaters rather than areas, revealing a clear distinction in military terminology. It can be seen that he is quite precise in his wording, emphasizing in particular that 1/3 of global shipping passes through the South China Sea rather than the Taiwan Strait. So, what exactly is the industry he is referring to? This is crucial to the U.S. economy. Therefore, preventing a conflict in the Taiwan Strait is key, and the ideal situation would be to maintain America's overwhelming military superiority. His wording was quite strong. He believes that maintaining military superiority to prevent a conflict in the Taiwan Strait is the United States' top priority, and that this also holds great importance for Taiwan's economic development. I invested 1 million yuan in publicity, which means I expect to receive a return of about 12,000 yuan. At the same time, he must maintain a long-term and clearly defined Taiwan policy. What he means is that the United States does not support any actions or policies that attempt to unilaterally change the current situation in Taiwan. The current situation in the Taiwan Strait must remain unchanged. In other words, China cannot unilaterally alter it, Taiwan cannot unilaterally alter it, and he himself will likewise not take any unilateral actions to change the status quo. He basically proposed what he called a declaratory policy. He stated that it was necessary to build sufficient military strength to resist and deter any attacks on the first island chain coming from different directions. The so-called first island chain, of course, includes Japan and the Philippines. He pointed out that the United States military actions should not be carried out alone, but rather in cooperation with allies in the Asia-Pacific region, instead of acting independently. He said that our allies must step forward. That is, they need to demonstrate firm resolve and the ability to take action. In addition, more resources must be invested, meaning a substantial increase in spending, to strengthen collective defense and shared security capabilities. Japan must bear the related expenses on its own, and this point needs to be made clear first. Since the Philippines lacks sufficient funds, Japan needs to invest more resources, which is a necessary condition for collective defense. At the same time, Taiwan should also increase its contributions. Therefore, the focus of U.S. diplomacy should be on promoting alliances and partnerships within the first island chain, enabling them to support and assist the United States in establishing a stronger military presence there, including the use of their ports and various facilities. Next, these countries are urged to invest more funds in their own defense, and more importantly, to increase investment in military capabilities and infrastructure. So what is the ultimate goal? The goal is to ensure that any form of aggression can be effectively deterred. Therefore, his point is that each country should bear its own expenses and invest more funds in military development. Only in this way can maritime security issues be effectively addressed and the entire first island chain be closely connected. At the same time, it is also necessary to strengthen the defense capabilities of the United States and its allies to deter any attempts to take control of Taiwan and to establish a military balance unfavorable to aggressors. That's basically the idea. So, all the discussions about Taiwan from beginning to end are actually centered around military issues. What does this really mean? In other words, the United States hopes to maintain a strong military deterrent in the Asia-Pacific region while avoiding a serious military conflict, so that China will not attempt to seize control of Taiwan by force. In addition, the wording he used would be more accurately translated as grasp rather than peace. He did not particularly emphasize any sophisticated ideas. It can be understood that the main point lies in preventing Taiwan from falling into China's hands, and such an interpretation is also reasonable. This passage states things very clearly. As for other related security challenges, they mainly refer to any power attempting to control the South China Sea. Who could that be? Of course, it's still China. And the rest of the discussion basically revolves around issues concerning the South China Sea. Therefore, the core objective of this U.S. National Security Report is to engage in strategic-level competition with China, while at the same time preventing a direct military conflict between the two countries. For this very reason, the United States is asking Japan to take on a more frontline role. Taiwan is being urged to invest more funds to build defensive capabilities strong enough to deter mainland China and prevent it from attempting to seize Taiwan. In short, that is the main point. You see, Taiwan's value is actually quite clearly constrained here. Many people emphasize Article 84 mentioned in the report, believing it shows Taiwan's importance, but in fact, much of the content reveals serious problems. After all, this report itself holds considerable significance. It at least reflects the worldview of the hardline right wing in the United States. Of course, a worldview is, by nature, an expression of personal position, and everyone inevitably holds their own unique perspective and framework. As for what is right or wrong, or the importance of the matter, that is another issue, for everyone has their own opinion. In this way, two questions worth considering remain. The first question is whether America's current national strength is sufficient to support the overall strategic direction proposed in this national security strategy. Formulating a macro-level strategy is not difficult. The real challenge lies in whether one has sufficient strength to support it. After all, the purpose of a strategy is to serve one's own interests, but the question is, do you have the strength to bear it? Does the United States today still possess sufficient strength to support this strategy? This question is not easy to answer and must be examined and considered from a relative perspective. If the United States were to adopt mainland China's approach, it could reach the vicinity of the first island chain, but would lack sufficient capability to maintain control over it. Nevertheless, the region would still generally remain within the sphere of American influence, especially Taiwan. In other words, once a war breaks out across the Taiwan Strait, it would be difficult for the United States to defeat the People's Liberation Army with military power alone. However, the United States' true objective is not to defeat the PLA, but to force China to pay a heavy price for it. As for how heavy a price the United States can make China pay, judging from the current situation, the two sides are still evenly matched. China is willing to bear the cost and has the corresponding capability. By contrast, the United States may be neither willing nor necessarily able to do so. Therefore, the ultimate outcome is that if both sides truly reach a stage of deterrence formed through military confrontation, the term they use is balance of military forces, meaning a balance of military power. That is, it refers to a situation in which both sides reach a state of parity or balance in military strength. In the areas surrounding the island of Taiwan, China holds an overwhelming advantage in the balance of military power, since the United States is about 10,000 kilometers away from. Even if the United States further strengthens its military bases in Asia, it still remains in a relatively weak position compared with the overall military strength of mainland China. Of course, when he first talked about Asia, he put forward an idea, and I think that idea is correct. He pointed out that the United States, together with its allies and friendly nations, accounts for more than 50% of the world's GDP, and that is correct. He then emphasized that we should make good use of this overall strength exceeding 50%. In a certain sense, this is my understanding. The purpose is to contain China and exert pressure on it, and this is the main point of his argument. In addition, he has also continued the Quad security dialogue mechanism promoted by Biden, which is a framework composed of Japan, Australia, the United States, and India, and he emphasized that this cooperative framework will continue to operate. He believes that such a framework, along with the vast alliance previously mentioned that covers more than 50% of the global economic volume, will to some extent make China reluctant to easily change or undermine the existing international status quo. If China were to choose to oppose the markets that account for more than 50% of the global share in order to launch a military attack on Taiwan, it would likely suffer more loss than gain. That is precisely the key point he has been calculating. As for how China will ultimately act, it will depend on its own considerations. All strategic thinking, in addition to requiring a broad subjective vision that aligns with one's own worldview and values, must also be built on an accurate assessment of the opponent. Because strategy is always a two-way interaction, especially in the G2 era, the rationality and feasibility of any strategy largely depend on the accuracy of one's judgment of the competitor's strategy. In addition, the behavior of the United States itself also deserves attention. To put it in our usual terms, it may be a case of overestimating its own capabilities while still trying to adopt a strategy of advancing through retreat. Because when people around the world read this national security strategy, the general conclusion they reach is that the United States is beginning to implement a strategic-level retreat. His strategic contraction has returned to the realm of classical Monroeism, and through hegemonic means, he consolidates his core interests in the Americas, turning the entire region into his own sphere of influence while excluding the involvement of external powers. This influence is extremely far-reaching, as if the situation had returned to that classical era of 1823. But on the other hand, if the United States can act in this way today, can China do the same? Can Russia? Can other countries also make such claims, for example by promoting so-called Asianism? Because Xi Jinping once put forward the idea of Asianism. When he emphasizes Asianism, does it imply that Asian affairs should be led by Asians and that a more assertive version of Asia should be presented? Although this cannot be called the Monroe Doctrine, what kind of impact would it have if the United States were to reduce its involvement in Asian affairs and adopt a more restrained stance? At present, the United States generally believes that it has the right to do and say these things because of its strong power and considerable strength. From the standpoint of strength and status, I believe I can do whatever I want, say whatever I please, smoke, drink, do anything I like, while you are not allowed to do anything. The key to this kind of double standard imposed on the world lies in whether the other side is willing to accept and bear such a standard. I believe that anyone who subjectively has the strength to contend with you would never accept your double standard approach. So, when China faces a national security strategy like that of the United States, what kind of response will it take? China's future strategic direction is worth paying attention to. Although the United States has ostensibly introduced a new strategy, it is not difficult to see that it still seeks to consolidate its interests in Asia and exert strong pressure on China. We are currently at a critical juncture of so-called balance of power. The balance point of this power is neither entirely in China's favor nor entirely in America's favor. From the perspective of Asianism, China is currently unable to support the entire ideal of Asianism. Because Japan and South Korea would never do this. As the second and third largest economies in Asia, they will inevitably choose to side with the United States rather than China. There is no doubt about that. Even in Southeast Asia, Singapore chooses to stand on the same side as the United States. At least for now, this is indeed the situation. Even though China has signed the RCEP agreement with Southeast Asian countries, we still cannot ignore an important phenomenon within it. Southeast Asia runs a trade surplus with China and likewise a surplus with the United States. What does this mean? It shows that the United States still holds considerable influence in the Southeast Asian region. Therefore, Southeast Asia relies on orders from the United States, and the US can even influence whether Europe places orders with Southeast Asia. At the same time, Southeast Asia's imports mainly depend on China, thus forming a closely connected upstream and downstream supply chain system. Therefore, when export orders are regarded as carrying greater political significance than import orders, it may be difficult for Southeast Asia to meet China's high expectations at critical moments. Therefore, in the Asia-Pacific region, China in fact has only half a friend, and that is Russia. It is called half a friend because more than half of Russia's economic focus does not lie in the Siberian region. Therefore, that is why we say this half a friend can still provide some assistance to China to some extent. Even though Russia is currently highly dependent on China economically, the bilateral trade volume is only just over 200 billion, which is not particularly large compared with other countries. Of course, although we are currently witnessing the development of China-Russia relations, this relationship has not yet formed a new economic system centered on China and Russia at the economic level. Therefore, whether it is China or Russia, the current overall economic system is still only a link within the global economic system built by the United States and Europe. Although there are contradictions between the two sides, they are still basically dependent on this system. As for why I set this title today, it is because Xi Jinping delivered an important speech at an economic conference in mainland China. At the Central Economic Work Conference held in Beijing on the 12th, yesterday, and the day before, Xi Jinping stated that the experience of coordinating domestic economic development and international economic and trade struggles should be better integrated. We must respond to external challenges by strengthening our own capabilities. Xi Jinping also emphasized the need to address local fiscal difficulties, uphold frugality in party and government organs, and referred to the achievements claimed in 2022 regarding the elimination of poverty. Xi Jinping stated that it is necessary to consolidate the achievements of poverty alleviation, and large-scale return to poverty must never occur. What does this statement mean? It means responding to external challenges through diligent internal strengthening, reflecting a highly defensive mindset. In China, statements of this tone have been uncommon in the past period of time. It could even be said that they rarely reveal such an unusually cautious, inwardly warning tone. What exactly is Xi Jinping explaining? Xi Jinping realized that the real estate policies introduced on the mainland in 2020 brought a significant impact to the country. This effect was reflected not only in the real estate market, but also extended to local finances. If local finances are not taken into account, the government debt of mainland China amounts to only 40% of GDP, which can be considered quite healthy among major countries. However, since 2020, with the increasing burden on local finances, China's overall fiscal debt has reached 100% of GDP, with local debt accounting for about 60%. This is one of the most important and significant sources of unhealthy conditions in China's economy. Next, we can use the balance sheet theory to further illustrate this. In other words, China has rapidly accumulated massive debts at the central government, local government, and individual levels. It will take quite a long time to resolve these debts. Therefore, the performance of domestic demand sectors such as the stock market and electric power aligns with the current economic situation, since the real estate market in mainland China is still continuing to decline. The decline in real estate prices is bound to weaken the purchasing power of the middle class. Some members of the middle class may thus fall into lower income groups, and those low-income groups that had just risen above the poverty line may once again slip below it. This has affected the original goal of lifting 600 million people out of poverty, resulting in a reduction in effectiveness. Therefore, this constitutes a major challenge faced within China, and the decline in middle-class purchasing power is also clearly reflected in the weakening demand for imported luxury goods. At the same time, this has also led to a decline in purchasing power for high-priced goods. In particular, demand has declined significantly in areas such as newly built houses and imported high-priced jewelry and clothing. Therefore, there has also been a decreasing trend in imported goods from France. Overall, from January to November this year, China's import and export growth rates were not balanced. Although imports grew rapidly, they still lagged behind export growth, resulting in the trade surplus exceeding $1 trillion during this period. The trade surplus for the entire previous year was only $840 billion, while by November this year, it had already exceeded $1 trillion. The main reason is that exports have expanded rapidly, whereas import growth has comparatively lagged behind. The reason for the lagging import growth, apart from the decline in consumer spending power and insufficient investment momentum in mainland China, lies more critically in the drop in raw material prices. The decline in raw material prices is also one of the main factors causing the impact. Although the import volume of raw materials has increased, their prices have dropped significantly, with commodities such as petroleum and iron ore being particularly affected. Some people believe that the expansion of mainland China's trade surplus is due to the undervaluation of the renminbi, but this view actually puts the cart before the horse. In fact, it is precisely the existence of the trade surplus that keeps the renminbi at a relatively low level. If the renminbi were indeed undervalued, what phenomena would it trigger? If the renminbi were undervalued, in theory, import prices should rise, thereby triggering imported inflation. However, in mainland China, not only has imported inflation not occurred, but even overall signs of inflation are not apparent, and prices continue to fall. This shows that the renminbi has not actually been undervalued, because the price level is the key indicator for determining whether a currency is undervalued. A trade surplus does not necessarily mean that a currency is undervalued. Many Western countries' arguments in this regard are indeed misunderstandings. By the same logic, the current exchange rate of the renminbi is around 7.07, and you consider this level to be a reasonable exchange rate level. No, whether an exchange rate is reasonable depends on whether there is inflation. The reason the United States is considered unreasonable is precisely because it faces an inflation problem. It's very simple. A true economist would not use data such as trade surpluses or deficits as the basis for evaluating a currency's value. That view is incorrect. To determine whether a currency is undervalued or overvalued, one should look at the state of inflation. For example, Japan is very worried that the yen's exchange rate might fall below the 160 mark. Why are they so concerned about this? Because once the exchange rate falls below 160, the prices of imported goods such as energy and coffee will rise sharply, and Japan will struggle to bear such cost pressures. prices have already begun to rise. And this is indeed the case in Japan, indicating that its renminbi is undervalued. Therefore, the renminbi must appreciate to correct this imbalance. Only when the renminbi appreciates will the upward trend in prices be eased. This is because most countries experience a structural phenomenon of imported inflation, where rising import costs tend to drive a general increase in domestic prices. Let's go back to what you mentioned earlier about the Chinese mainland needing to strengthen its internal capabilities. Indeed, it must focus on enhancing its own strength and properly addressing local fiscal and real estate issues, as these two are closely linked to whether true poverty alleviation can be achieved. You're right, that's indeed the case. The root of the problem lies in local public finances. Overall, the growth of exports in mainland China mainly depends on the development of new products, the expansion of new markets, and the application of new methods. What does this mean? The so-called new products refer to what we often call the new three items, such as electric vehicles, batteries, and optoelectronic products, which are representatives of high-tech industries. Speaking of new markets, for China, Russia is almost a newly emerged market that has appeared out of nowhere. In addition, Latin America and Southeast Asia are also rapidly rising new trade regions. These developments are undoubtedly important outcomes brought about by Xi Jinping's promotion of the Belt and Road Initiative. Because without well-developed shipping routes, transportation networks, and basic infrastructure such as the China-Europe freight trains, many new markets simply could not be developed. It is precisely these ongoing and accumulated efforts that have ultimately led to the rapid growth of exports. This is not what outsiders call an oversupply or overproduction. Such a claim is inaccurate. In fact, in China's case, orders and demand come first, and only then is production capacity expanded accordingly, rather than producing first and then seeking orders. Therefore, in this situation, production capacity expands in step with the increase in orders, and this development trend is very evident. We can see that many people in the West often ignore the basic principles of economics, reverse cause and effect, and arbitrarily accuse China of having problems of overproduction or oversupply. However, without orders from them, how could China possibly have overproduction? Alright, setting aside all kinds of external criticisms for now, China's most important current task is to implement a third, entirely new development approach. Over the past period of time, this new approach, by partially applying artificial intelligence technologies, has made market expansion easier and more efficient. Yiwu is a typical example. The local merchants had been working hard to learn English and were gradually becoming fluent. But suddenly, they had to shift their market focus to the Middle East and Latin America, facing completely different linguistic and cultural challenges. With the help of China's advanced language translation models, they have successfully overcome all linguistic and cultural barriers. Today, Yiwu performs exceptionally well in the Middle Eastern market. Many merchants can speak fluent Arabic, and the little Yiwu, established by China in the Middle East, is also thriving, demonstrating strong competitiveness. It has become an important procurement center for the Arab world. The entire Arab world can be described as half paradise and half hell. While the wealthy regions are financially strong, the relatively poorer areas rely on China's cost-effective products to meet their daily needs. They tend to buy these affordable goods rather than purchase the same, but more expensive products from Europe and the United States. Therefore, China's advantage lies in the continuous emergence of innovative approaches, a new model that can connect various channels and promote comprehensive integration. The continuous expansion of China's exports does not stem from an undervalued renminbi, favorable exchange rates, or low labor costs, but rather from the results achieved through the development of new products, the exploration of new markets, and the application of innovative methods. To continuously maintain these three advantages in the future, China must keep enhancing its capabilities and strengthening its internal foundations in order to consolidate and extend its competitive edge. On the Chinese mainland, there are now only two ways to expand domestic demand. One is to increase investment, and the other is to raise government spending. However, because debt has risen sharply in a short period of time, the government faces great difficulty and challenges in further expanding its spending. Secondly, when discussing private investment, we must face the reality that, Apart from a few areas such as the new three types I just mentioned, there has not been a noticeable increase in private investment in other sectors. This concerns how mainland China can further open up to attract foreign investment. Since many foreign enterprises have withdrawn, efforts must be made to bring in new investment. Similarly, the withdrawal of some Taiwan-funded and Hong Kong-funded capital shows a similar pattern, and the current focus is on how to encourage these funds to return. The most representative example is Li Ka-shing, who has withdrawn his capital from mainland China. At present, Li Ka-shing's son is gradually re-entering mainland China, investing in industries different from those of his father. Since Li Ka-shing is not adept at investing in the technology sector, and Richard Li no longer wishes to engage in real estate, the key lies in how to accelerate this transformation and pace of investment. Among these, maintaining Hong Kong's status is of vital importance. To ensure that foreign investment continues to play a significant role in China, it is essential, as before, to make sure that Hong Kong remains the most crucial window, the central platform, and the most influential international financial center. Mainland China does not permit the issuance of stablecoins, but the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government has allowed their issuance. This actually demonstrates the implementation of the one country, two systems principle at the economic level, and this direction is the right one. This also explains why incidents related to the Port of Panama occurred some time ago. Hong Kong's Ta Kung Pao once launched an attack on Li Ka-shing, but I believe this approach was completely wrong. The target of the attack was not Li Ka-shing himself, but rather the symbol and cornerstone of Hong Kong as the most essential element of China's international financial center. Only when politics does not interfere with the economy can a financial center be established and develop steadily. As long as any entrepreneur's investment and business activities comply with commercial laws, they should not be targeted for any political reasons. We chose to use Upwork because it offers an integrated solution that can efficiently meet various business needs. You can use this platform to find hospitals, hire professionals, and conveniently complete the payment process. Only after this system is established can it truly become an international financial center. Hong Kong's status as China's international financial center is far more important than various other secondary and insignificant considerations. When I put forward this argument at the time, I was severely criticized not only in Taiwan, but also harshly condemned on the mainland. However, time has proven that my view was correct, and the facts have clearly confirmed my judgment. Moreover, the mainland has never expressed any stance on this issue from beginning to end. I believe this fully demonstrates that Beijing's attitude is more appropriate than those low-quality media in Hong Kong, and such restraint and rationality deserve recognition. This proves that Li Chang is indeed more capable than Li Keqiang. He has continued to promote openness policies and has repeatedly invited various online influencers to visit mainland China for promotion. Since Li Chang took office, the mainland's global image has noticeably improved. It is clearly evident that his style is much more open than Li Keqiang's, with a noticeable difference. You see, the current way of thinking is no longer as conservative as before. Toward visits from online influencers, especially Tang Xianglong's arrival, he appears more enthusiastic and welcoming. Moreover, all regions are now open to visits, and Xinjiang also welcomes travelers. You can go wherever you want, with no restrictions due to issues like the poverty line. What kind of impact will such an open attitude have on enhancing China's international image? This directly affects international consumption and investment, as the two are closely linked. Therefore, I believe China has successfully overcome the various difficulties and pressure from the United States it faced earlier, achieving remarkable results. To say nothing else, even Trump has now been forced to allow the sale of H-200 to mainland China, because they have realized that suppression is completely ineffective. The more crucial issue lies not only in the futility of such suppression, but in the fact that this approach is fundamentally counterproductive. Therefore, they believe that continuing the confrontation is no longer worthwhile, and it would be better to try to win over Xi Jinping instead. It's as if they were saying, "Brother Jinping, I'm Trump, and now I'm willing to sell you the H-200. The H-200 is indeed the mainstream AI chip at present. By contrast, Brownville has yet to be considered mainstream. For this reason, he resolutely decided to push the sales of the main product, completely ignoring the unreasonable criticism from those American politicians. This means that on one hand, he wants to prevent China from taking Taiwan by military means, while on the other hand, he hopes to maintain friendly relations with China to avoid becoming opposing sides and triggering an armed conflict. As for the final outcome, there are still variables, and it is difficult to draw a conclusion yet. Therefore, we can clearly see that it is reasonable and necessary for mainland China to focus on strengthening its own capabilities. The top priority is to revitalize the real estate market and promote domestic consumption growth, rather than constantly criticizing weak domestic demand. In fact, the sluggish domestic consumption is mainly because the only sector capable of driving the economy is real estate, and apart from that, there is almost no other support. Always maintains a neutral and slightly conservative tone. However, this time, aside from maintaining the usual neutral, slightly conservative, and cautious tone, I feel that the sense of crisis conveyed is even stronger than before. The meaning of such remarks is that the party and government systems must tighten their belts, live frugally, and strictly forbid large-scale acts of defiance. Such cautionary wording has never appeared. So how much longer will these difficult days last? I think at least another 2 years. The reason I say this is that the economic cycle on the Chinese mainland tends to experience fluctuations or difficulties about once every 4 years, and this has become an economic phenomenon. However, overall, I don't feel worried. At the end of last year, most media outlets were predicting the economic growth rate of mainland China. At that time, my estimated range was a minimum of 4.4% and a maximum of 4.9%. This forecast was once ridiculed by many, who thought it was impossible for China to achieve such a high growth rate. At that time, the IMF predicted 3.8%, while the World Bank estimated 3.7%. Now these figures have all been revised upward. See, my prediction was right again. This makes it the third consecutive year. But really, what is there to be proud of about that? This is your area of expertise. No, it just shows that although I'm getting older, my professional ability hasn't declined. Haha, alright then. Moving on, from last November to this November, the economic growth rate for the first 3 quarters reached 5.2%. The fourth quarter happens to coincide with Christmas, so don't be too quick to draw conclusions. So you said it was impossible for the economic growth rate to fall below 5. At the time, I estimated it would be between 4.9 and 5.4, and after careful calculation, I thought that was a reasonable range. The actual figure turned out to be in the middle, around 5.2 to 5.4. In the past, they always said my estimates were wildly exaggerated, believing that my judgments were biased because I loved China too much. But in fact, I simply approached the issues themselves and analyzed the situation rationally. As you said, that's the kind of person with no friends, no relatives, who doesn't even acknowledge their own kin, a completely and utterly heartless type. In another 2 years, of course we can continue to pay attention, because the 15th plan will be officially announced at next year's 2 sessions. As the 15th plan is about to be released, I believe the period from now until next year's 2 sessions will be a transitional phase. This is not only the closing stage of economic policy, but also a time for observation and oversight. At present, energy is being accumulated, and after the 15th plan is officially introduced at next year's 2 sessions, it will bring a new wave of development momentum, defining the overall direction and intensity of advancement for the next 5 years. By that time, when we observe the subsequent economic trends of mainland China, a completely new outlook should emerge. Therefore, in the next few months, it may be wise to regard this period as a transitional phase. Regarding your mention of the term transitional phase, I still feel that it is somewhat insufficient. In fact, as early as 3 years ago, or more precisely, about 5 years ago, I began discussing the real estate problems in mainland China. At the same time, I also raised another important issue, the phenomenon of excessively high unemployment rates. Of course, you could also say that I regard excessively high unemployment as an economic judgment. On this point, I agree with the views of the relevant departments, and I concur with such an assessment. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, the unemployment rate in mainland China during this period has exceeded 5%. From my intuition, an unemployment rate above 5% is a potential factor of social instability. Moreover, after the unemployment rate exceeds 5%, the situation becomes even more severe, especially among highly educated young people. Therefore, how to address this issue and reduce the unemployment rate among the younger population as well as nationwide holds extremely important significance for China's political system. Therefore, it can be seen that this work meeting did not focus much on this issue. However, it is hoped that in next year's meeting, more comprehensive and concrete solutions can be proposed. I believe that, given China's current economic system, it should be capable of reducing the unemployment rate to 4%. In other words, the unemployment rate needs to drop by more than 1 percentage point. This, of course, means that a large number of new jobs must be created. However, as China is gradually adjusting its industrial structure toward capital-intensive sectors, its overall competitiveness has been improving accordingly. But do not forget, many people are unable to engage in higher-level professions and therefore must look for other ways out. In view of this, I have proposed an idea that I call the Kim Dae-jung strategy. So what is the Kim Dae-jung strategy? The so-called strategy is to channel funds from profitable industries to non-profitable ones in order to improve overall employment opportunities. So how should this game be played? Let me explain it to everyone next. That year, Samsung achieved great success thanks to its strong mobile phone sales performance and launched large-scale advertising campaigns everywhere. In the Chinese market, Samsung's ads were visible almost everywhere, and the company earned considerable profits as a result. In addition, Samsung also earned substantial profits from its DRAM and semiconductor businesses. At that time, Kim Dae-jung decisively instructed Samsung to invest these funds in the film and television industry in order to stimulate the development of the service sector. Therefore, Samsung invested extensive advertising resources into endorsements by Korean singers and movie stars, and sponsored their concerts and film productions, including popular works such as Jewel in the Palace. Many people do not know that the main source of funding behind these projects was actually the Samsung Group, and that Samsung was compelled to invest under policy initiatives in order to achieve the goal of dispersing capital. During that period, the wage growth rate in South Korea's service and media industries was actually on par with that of the manufacturing industry. This formed a sharp contrast with Taiwan, where the wage growth rate in manufacturing has consistently far exceeded that of the service sector. Subsequently, he effectively increased the employment rate and reduced the unemployment rate through this industrial strategy. China might also study and draw on this development model. Alright, this will take some time to observe. However, Xingyuan just mentioned a period of about 2 years, and I think that estimate is quite reasonable. I just mentioned that Xi Jinping's speech at this year's Central Economic Work Conference, although continuing his usual style and tone. I mean, when it comes to explaining policies, Xi Jinping's expression style has always been pragmatic and low-key, which can be said to be completely opposite to Trump's flamboyant style. Nowadays, China and the United States, although referred to by Trump as the two major global powers of the G2. However, these two countries known as the G2 not only have obvious differences in their founding ideologies and fundamental mindsets, but their leaders also have completely opposite styles. Therefore, it will still take time to see how everything unfolds. In fact, I think the current contest between China and the United States is more like a competition between the overall quality and capability of the two countries' leadership teams. Therefore, in terms of the competition over leadership quality, the leadership team on the Chinese mainland is indeed worthy of expectation, though continued effort will still be needed in the future. All of this will ultimately be judged by history. Next, let us turn our attention to the joint patrol operations of China and Russia. I attach particular importance to this China-Russia joint patrol because it is clearly different from the previous 9 patrol operations. In addition to the many so-called firsts we have seen, this operation also contains more underlying details and has triggered profound changes on the geopolitical level. What do you think? Although this is the 14th joint bomber patrol between the East and Russia, the bombers are naturally accompanied by fighter jets for escort operations. Past patrols were mainly concentrated in the Sea of Japan and the Sea of Okhotsk, usually turning back near Alaska at most. These operations were mostly to coordinate with Russia's security needs in the northern regions, serving especially as preliminary deployments. However, this time the situation is completely different. Surprisingly, this operation advanced southward, not merely moving toward Japan, but directly crossing the Tsushima Strait and circling around to the Miyako Strait. For the China-Russia Joint Patrol, this carries entirely different and far-reaching strategic significance. Because the bombers deployed this time, especially China's H-6K model, possess powerful armament capabilities. They can not only carry cruise missiles, but also long-range anti-ship missiles such as the Changjian-20. This is beyond doubt. In addition, it can also carry a variety of new types of glide bombs. Some even refer to them as loitering missiles, but in fact, they are a type of smart bomb with drone-like characteristics. This time, it poses a direct and explicit threat to Japan, unlike previous operations carried out merely in the name of maintaining maritime security. In the past, the goal was to demonstrate the need to defend Russia's far eastern region, particularly Vladivostok and Siberia, and China was essentially cooperating with Russian operations. This time, however, the situation is completely reversed. Russia is cooperating with China and carrying out a strategic deployment aimed at breaking through the Miyako Strait. Because the United States and Japan are following the aforementioned national security strategy of the United States, their core objective is to further strengthen the defense and strategic deployment of the first island chain. In fact, the strategic intent behind it lies in Japan's attempt to extend from the northernmost Hokkaido all the way to the southernmost Yonaguni Island, building a complete missile attack chain. This missile attack chain encompasses various types such as surface-to-air missiles, anti-ship missiles, and surface-to-ground missiles, with a range of over 1,000 kilometers, enough to be launched from Ishigaki Island south of the Miyako Islands to accurately strike distant targets. From a geographic distance perspective, the missile range is sufficient to cover Shanghai at about 950 kilometers, and hitting Xiamen would be only around 580 kilometers, both well within the missile's effective strike range. Such a deployment can not only blockade the Taiwan Strait, but also control the Hualien-Taitung coast and even block the Bashi Channel. At the same time, a deployment extending northward can also effectively blockade the Kuril Islands. Therefore, from Hokkaido, passing through Aomori in Honshu and Maizuru in northern Kyoto, all the way to the Tsubaime base, as well as maritime ports such as Sasebo along the Seto Inland Sea coast, and extending further south to Yokosuka, the missile systems along this entire strategic route are in continuous deployment and preparation. These deployments are all aimed at further strengthening defense capabilities, while the United States also plans to deploy the Typhoon missile system to Japan. The implication is that Japan and the U.S. can, by leveraging Japan's strategic location, jointly safeguard the security of the first island chain, covering the Taiwan region. This also echoes Ms. Sanai's view that an emergency for Japan is an emergency for Taiwan, and an emergency for Taiwan is a survival crisis for Japan, serving as the military basis for exercising the right of collective self-defense. So, if we want to destroy this missile attack chain, how should we proceed? It does not rely entirely on the so-called Dongfeng missiles, because they are extremely costly and not economical for attacking such missile bases. Therefore, the key lies in using bombers to carry out precision strike missions. Then, what about the bombers? A high-altitude bomber like the Tu-95 may not be easily intercepted by surface-to-air missiles. As for China's H-6K, its airframe is only about half the size of the Tu-95. Moreover, missile attacks may not necessarily hit their targets accurately. Especially when escorted by fighter jets, it also has the ability to intercept incoming missiles. If additional defensive or expulsion lines are deployed on the ground, these lines will play a significant strategic role when striking the opponent, especially the various missile bases within Japan. In addition, these projectiles are not only cheaper than Dongfeng missiles, but also more numerous. Therefore, the main goal of this China-Russia Joint Patrol is to address Japan's attempt to establish a missile attack chain and to consider how to break through and how can it be destroyed? Does Japan understand the implication? They do. Can the United States understand it? Of course. Therefore, I judge that after the conclusion of the China-Russia joint patrol, the United States and Japan will, after some time, inevitably launch another so-called military exercise as a countermeasure. Of course, at present, US B-52 bombers have already begun joint operations with Japanese fighter jets around the Sea of Japan, and such a situation generally aligns with the logical development of the overall situation. Although the B-52 is a relatively old bomber, its operations in the Sea of Japan can largely be described using Mao Zedong's phrase, "I come to your house, and you come to mine." However, its current activities in the Sea of Japan still cannot be regarded as truly entering the other party's domain. The B-52's operations in the Sea of Japan have had a certain degree of impact on North Korea and Russia, and China is no exception. Unless its area of activity shifts to the Yellow Sea or the East China Sea next time, the impact will remain limited. However, whether the rivalry between the China-Russia partnership and the US-Japan alliance will further intensify remains to be seen. The situation will indeed escalate, but there still exists a clear boundary, namely the principle emphasized by Trump of avoiding direct military conflict. After all, Trump is accustomed to adopting a strategy of maximum pressure, but for China, this approach may not necessarily be effective. Because China will also make an extreme response, it is clear from Mayor Gao's remarks that the Chinese side's attitude is precisely a typical form of extreme reaction. When dealing with the United States, China may still be able to show a degree of flexibility and tolerance, but toward Japan, China has almost no room to make concessions. We can then consider another question. What exactly does Russia think about all this? Why is Russia now showing such a high level of interest in Asian affairs? It should be noted that, whether before or after the Cold War, Russia has never, as it has in the past couple of years, so actively demonstrated such a strong willingness to participate and sense of presence. Russia's presence has increased significantly, far surpassing that of the past. Even in its rhetoric and actions, Russia often takes the lead ahead of China, using stronger language to make comments and actively engaging in Asian affairs. Therefore, this Sino-Russian joint patrol took place immediately after the high-level strategic dialogue between Wang Yi and Yuri Ushakov, fully reflecting the coordination and joint composition of China and Russia in the so-called joint patrol operation. This is not merely a display, but rather, in the event of an imminent conflict, China and Russia would also be able to quickly form a bomber formation with powerful destructive capabilities and complete it with very high efficiency. Our focus of observation has been mostly on China-Japan relations, but the question is, what is Russia doing? Is the strategic mutual trust between China and Russia really as solid as it appears on the surface? Two phenomena can be observed here, the first of which may be called the alliance phenomenon. The other may be called the leverage phenomenon. As for the so-called alliance phenomenon, it refers to the fact that Russia actually faces no major strategic or security challenges in the Siberian region. The so-called alliance phenomenon refers to Russia's proactive and explicit expression of a strong strategic intention and willingness to cooperate in forming a military alliance with China. Therefore, in the past it was Russia that asked China to cooperate, but now it is Russia that actively follows China's pace. In terms of political stance, Russia's attitude is even more proactive than China's, openly expressing opposition to Taiwan's independence and taking related positions and actions. Therefore, at times China's statements are relatively moderate, while Russia's stance is more hardline. The Russian side aims to firmly consolidate the kind of military alliance between China and Russia that, though not formally signed, exists in practice. Secondly, what benefits does this kind of alliance actually bring? One of them is that it can generate a leveraging effect. So what exactly is this so-called leveraging effect? As the China-Russia military alliance grows stronger in the Asian region, this trend can effectively ease the strategic pressure that Russia faces in Europe. This means that if the United States chooses to confront Russia in Europe, it will inevitably have to divert its energy and resources in the Asian region. Therefore, as the alliance between Russia and China becomes increasingly solid, the United States will find its room for troop deployment in Europe relatively constrained. After all, Europe is the core region of Russia's strategic security, and when the United States undertakes strategic contraction in Europe, it signifies that Russia has achieved success in its overall strategic layout. If the United States redeploys its military forces to the Asian region or further strengthens Japan's armed capabilities, thereby fueling its militaristic tendencies, it will inevitably have a profound impact on the regional landscape. For Russia, the leverage created by this situation lies in the fact that it can force the United States and Japan to pay an equal or even higher price while investing only a minimal cost. I just got back from Yunnan and would like to share some travel experiences with everyone. At the same time, I often hear people say that Russia doesn't seem to have to pay much of a price. But if a military conflict were to occur, it would actually be China that bears most of the cost. For a strategic master like Putin, this deal is effortless. He can accomplish it with just a few words, so why bother thinking too hard? Alright, next, let's take a look at something I mentioned yesterday. After all, whether it's Liu Baojia or Huang Weihan, they're longtime friends we've known for many years, and we all know each other very well. However, after Liu Baojia left the TV station, he indeed remained quiet for a period of time, until at some point, he suddenly began contributing articles, once again publicly discussing the issues of unification and independence as well as cross-strait relations, which reignited public. In addition, he displayed an extremely strong critical attitude toward Ma Ying-jeou, believing that Ma's advocacy of the One China stance, and even his related policy positions, essentially amounted to a typical act of selling out Taiwan. He emphasized that cross-strait relations must never be defined as a domestic affair. Afterwards, he was also invited to Huang Weihan's program to further elaborate on his views. I actually didn't care at first, thinking that everyone would just speak from their own standpoint, and I already had an idea of what he would say, so it didn't surprise me. Unexpectedly, at that moment, Tsai Ching-yuan spoke up and shared his opinion. After Tsai Ching-yuan made his comments and posted related content on Facebook, I thought to myself, this has really turned into a matter worth paying attention to. If someone else were talking about this matter, I wouldn't mind, but when Tsai Ching-yuan offered his opinion, I felt his logic and analysis were indeed quite profound and worth sharing with everyone. What do you think about this matter? Please express your thoughts fully and share your opinions without reservation. I am observing phenomena objectively, not from any subjective standpoint. My observation is that many second- and third-generation mainlanders are showing a tendency toward Taiwan independence, which is a phenomenon worth noting. I call this phenomenon alienation. This concept is often mentioned in leftist philosophy, especially in Marxist philosophy, referring to a state of self-alienation, in which a person gradually becomes disconnected from their own essence. This situation does not entirely fall under self-alienation. Rather, it is closer to what can be called over-generation alienation, that is, the phenomenon of intergenerational alienation. What kind of phenomenon is this? In fact, there is indeed a clear difference between the political memories of local residents and those of people from other provinces. The political memory of local residents encompasses the historical processes from migration to Taiwan during the Qing dynasty, Japanese colonial rule, service as soldiers for Japan, to the Kuomintang takeover and the era of the two Changs. This entire journey, marked by multiple regime changes and social transformations before and after World War II, constitutes what is known as the political memory of local. The political memory of people from other provinces encompasses a series of major historical events, from the Wuchang Uprising, the Xinhai Revolution, the War of Resistance against Japan, the Northern Expedition for Unification, and the Chinese Civil War, to the anti-communist movement, ultimately ending with retreating to Taiwan. Therefore, what actually exists here is a kind of composite political memory, two different historical experiences coexisting. Such differences are reflected in the political behavior of native Taiwanese and people from other provinces, often showing clear distinctions. Moreover, within the group of people from other provinces, a further distinctive phenomenon has emerged. In other words, there is an extremely distinct, almost leap-like gap in political stance between the second generation of mainlanders and the first generation. People like Liang Wenjie, Wang Dingyu, Zhao Tianlin, and Zhang Yakin are examples of this kind, and there are actually quite a lot of them. If you count carefully, the list is indeed quite long. For example, Si Chenwu, Cho Yuko, Duan Yikong, and many scholars who currently hold government positions are representative figures of this kind. When we discuss this phenomenon, we are not judging whether it is right or wrong, but simply describing a historical and political phenomenon. When the mainlanders first came to Taiwan, the fundamental basis of their political legitimacy was precisely built upon the premise that Taiwan is a part of China. The political legitimacy of mainlanders coming to Taiwan was mainly founded on the idea that I must accomplish the unification of China and oppose the communist regime. Of course, it is evident that with the passage of time, such political legitimacy has gradually weakened and converged into the so-called One China policy or One China principle. In the context of Taiwan, this is reflected in the one country, two areas framework stipulated by the Constitution of the Republic of China, namely, one Republic of China with two regions, the Taiwan area and the mainland area. For many second-generation mainlander friends, they often face a dilemma. As their social circles gradually move beyond the scope of the original mainlander communities, they must enter the vast ocean of the native Taiwanese people's political memories, learning to adapt and understand, and ultimately turning back to reflect on and examine their own political memories and identity. Thus, they may find themselves gradually becoming a political island, a situation similar to the phenomenon once exhibited by Cheng Luwen in earlier times. However, as cross-strait relations have gone through many twists and turns, it has become clear that the idea of counterattacking the mainland is no longer feasible. In contrast, the possibility and initiative of China promoting unification with Taiwan have gradually increased. Therefore, they hope to free themselves from the historical entanglements of the Chinese Civil War and view this conflict as a war between nations. From this perspective, countries such as the United States and Japan could legitimately intervene and provide support, assisting Taiwan in confronting the unification campaign initiated by mainland China. If this conflict is defined as a civil war, then according to international conventions, other countries should refrain from intervening. Therefore, if cross-strait relations are not defined as relations between two countries, but are instead characterized as a state in which both sides are not subordinate to each other, then the conflict across the Taiwan Strait can be regarded as a civil war. Therefore, Liu Baojia's view asserts that cross-strait relations should not be defined as one China, nor described as one country, two regions, and even less regarded as a continuation of a civil war. Rather, they should be understood as two politically independent entities that are not subordinate to each other. In this way, if mainland China were to launch a war for unification, it could be defined as an act of aggression against Taiwan. At that point, the international community would be justified in aiding Taiwan, and countries such as the United States and Japan could use this as a basis for military intervention. If international forces were to intervene militarily, the pro-independence factions in Taiwan might be able to resist the mainland China's armed unification, and this would be regarded as the true expression of loving Taiwan. In addition, when Liu Baojia was interviewed by Fong Weihan, he inadvertently mentioned two key words that especially caught my attention. He said, "We are Taiwanese people who belong to Taiwan's democratic system." Henry Fung stated that he not only hopes to break away from the governmental entanglements between the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China, as well as the historical ties left by the Chinese Civil War, but also further asserts that his identity transcends the framework of Chinese democracy, positioning himself as a Taiwanese belonging to Taiwanese democracy. Such an ideology already belongs to the level of pro-Taiwan independence thought represented by the Taiwan Independence Alliance, while the current mainstream stance of the Democratic Progressive Party has not yet developed to that extent. As for the Taiwan Independence Alliance and the mainstream thinking of the Democratic Progressive Party, they have so far only developed to the stage of Taiwanization of the Republic of China proposed by Nuo Lin political warfare. That is, taking a Taiwanized Republic of China as the form and putting on the Republic of China label as a decoration and packaging for Taiwan independence. Only in this way is the advocacy of Taiwan independence more likely to succeed. In the 1980s, the suggestion that Norin Jingzhan made to Li Tinghui was to adopt a concept similar to that of Wang Meng usurping Liu Baojia's generation, having long lived in a pervasive pro-independence media environment, had to adapt to such an atmosphere for the sake of survival and identity. Otherwise, he might have become a political outcast or faced difficulties in defining himself. As a result, he ultimately fully accepted and embraced the highly radical ideals of the Taiwan Independence Alliance, identifying himself as a Taiwanese belonging to the Taiwanese nation. What does this mean? It shows that Liu Baojia has become seriously disconnected from the political legitimacy and historical memory represented by his father when he came to Taiwan. His ideological tendency has shifted toward the most extreme layers of political memory among native Taiwanese. In philosophical terms, this phenomenon is called alienation, that is, the process by which people or things that were once similar gradually become dissimilar. Su Li even referred to this opposing phenomenon as alienation. Therefore, I use the term the alienation of the second-generation mainlanders to describe this kind of social phenomenon. It should be noted that this is not only a social phenomenon, but also a political one. As the process of cross-strait reunification continues to be delayed, this situation has become increasingly evident. Over time, the alienation of this group of people from other provinces will intensify and continue to rise among the younger generation. Although some people believe that Zhiahongshu might help the younger generation develop a favorable impression of the mainland and thereby promote the process of reunification, such a possibility does indeed exist. But as I said, the key to reunification does not lie in whether people have positive or negative feelings toward the mainland, nor in whether it is profitable, but in whether the mainland can demonstrate concrete and powerful actions that make the Taiwan side feel the necessity of seriously considering and sitting down to discuss reunification. Only under pressure can reunification possibly occur. Without pressure, reunification will not be achieved. That is why I have put forward a highly controversial view. Peace cannot bring about unification, and unification is difficult to achieve under peaceful circumstances. In the absence of pressure, it is almost impossible for the native Taiwanese on the island, who carry a unique historical memory, to accept the conditions for unification. Similarly, in the absence of pressure, it is also impossible for the gradually assimilated second, third, or even fourth generations of mainlanders to naturally merge into the collective memory of the native Taiwanese as time passes and the island's sense of isolation fades. They gradually forgot the ancestral roots that had first brought them to Taiwan. Although a trend of seeking one's roots has emerged in society, this force is still not strong enough to shake the overall situation. Likewise, even with the curator phenomenon, it cannot produce a substantial impact on the overall picture. Therefore, what I interpret are the phenomena I have personally observed. For this very reason, I have step-by-step inferred that the Kuomintang, as the largest political force resisting Taiwan independence and balancing the Democratic Progressive Party, is indispensable and should not disappear. If such a disappearance were to occur, cross-strait relations would fall into an extremely severe situation. However, what would follow is an unavoidable paradox. If the Kuomintang wants to continue existing in Taiwan, it cannot fully conform to the mainland's Taiwan policy or the ideology it advocates. If this is the case, it will cause many centrist voters to turn away due to a lack of understanding or acceptance, ultimately leading the Kuomintang to follow in the footsteps of the New Party and the People First Party, gradually fading from the political scene in Taiwan. Such a situation would cause Taiwanese society to fall into a state of perpetual one-party dominance by the Democratic Progressive Party. The Ko-Wen-je phenomenon can be regarded as a variant of the DPP, with its political stance generally leaning toward the center-left or Green camp. The Kuomintang should seize this opportunity to become the most crucial force in resisting the Democratic Progressive Party's efforts to promote the Taiwanization of the Republic of China toward independence. Therefore, the reason I feel worried is that in the next two elections, in 2026 and 2028, the Kuomintang might inexplicably be labeled as pro-unification with China, leading to a significant loss of votes. Therefore, I have always felt worried and uneasy about the current Kuomintang leadership's excessive emphasis on cross-strait relations. In particular, Kaohsiung's original chance of regaining victory may have completely vanished because someone questioned Hu Xin's neutral stance when facing the Taiwan independence platform. Many people disagree with his stance on cross-strait relations, but I hold the opposite view. No matter whether it's a black cat or a white cat, as long as it can win back Kaohsiung, it's a good cat. If he intends to run for election in Kaohsiung, he must take that stance. Yes, you're right. Of course, some people criticize the Kuomintang for favoring a certain position. But my belief is very clear. The essence of politics is the struggle for power. If you cannot gain political power, politics loses its meaning for you. Without political power in hand, you cannot govern public affairs. Sun Yat-sen's set of ideas was, in fact, built upon the historical opportunity he and Chiang Kai-shek seized through the Northern Expedition to achieve unification and to gain political power. Therefore, if the Kuomintang loses the ability to compete for political power, it will inevitably head toward decline. In Taiwan, the core mechanism for contesting power is elections. If the Kuomintang cannot win in elections, it will inevitably become increasingly marginalized. Such a decline would have an extremely unfavorable impact on the peaceful reunification of the two sides. Even if reunification could not be achieved, an even heavier price would inevitably have to be paid. All right, with the arrival of the Trump 2.0 era, and as China, U.S. relations enter a brand new stage of interaction, what we just discussed was precisely about Xi Jinping's remarks at the China, U.S. economic conference. First of all, everyone must have a more macro and higher-level overall perspective. In other words, since the Trump 1.0 era began a comprehensive disruption of the global economic order, the economic systems of countries around the world have experienced structural problems over the years. Because the external structure has undergone tremendous changes, let me further explain that oil protectionism is merely a concrete manifestation of alienation. The reason he strongly criticizes Ma Ying-jeou for betraying Taiwan is that, in his view, if the Republic of China were to detach itself from China as its core element, it would resemble the puppet regime of traitors under Wang Jingwei. After all, dividing national territory has always been regarded as a nation's gravest crime. Therefore, when he points one finger at Ma Ying-jeou accusing him of betraying Taiwan, 4 fingers are actually pointing back at himself, revealing that he is the real traitor. In addition, he would not harshly accuse mainlanders like us of betraying Taiwan, because there are deep historical roots behind it. Therefore, as long as he uses sharp words to attack Ma Ying-jeou, who like himself is a second-generation mainlander, this behavior precisely confirms what I call the phenomenon of alienation, a philosophical inference in which internal contradictions lead to opposing conflict. You just mentioned the relationship between China and the United States. At present, from my perspective, the United States' position is quite firm. It neither wants China to change the current situation, nor supports Taiwan's independence, and is even less willing to see China achieve reunification. On the contrary, the United States prefers that Taiwan remain within its sphere of influence for the long term. Therefore, if China hopes to break through this situation, it will still require a considerable amount of time and effort. In addition, China should not keep emphasizing that time is on its side, as I believe such an assessment carries significant risks. However, at least over the past 10 years, especially since the Liaoning aircraft carrier gained combat capability in 2015, one can clearly observe that the situation in the Western Pacific has undergone extremely dramatic changes. When I studied Trump's national security strategy, it was evident from the continuity of U.S. national security strategies that what he actually rejected was Obama's pivot to Asia policy. In other words, the pivot to Asia and Asia-Pacific rebalance strategies of the Obama era have been declared over in this National Security Strategy report. So, how will the United States handle affairs in the Asia-Pacific region now? This does not mean that the United States will immediately withdraw, creating a power vacuum. I also mentioned this point not long ago when I met with Suu Kyi, and it serves well as the conclusion of today's discussion. During the interview, the words Suu Kyi said deeply resonated with me, and I completely agree with her views. She pointed out that the world of the future would be in a delicate situation. The United States is unwilling to settle for second place, while China does not wish to take the lead. So, where will such a world be headed? She found herself caught in precisely this kind of contradiction. The United States is unwilling to be second, yet believes others are trying to pull it down from its top position. China has no intention of becoming the world's leader, but when the United States begins to pull back its influence, the world's attention naturally turns to China. Therefore, the maturation and development of China's role in geopolitical and international affairs will become a key focus worthy of close attention in the future. Although Xi Jinping emphasizes the need to focus on strengthening internal capabilities, I believe that China's future role, behavioral patterns, and expression of its international values on the global stage will be among the key topics of shared interest and research for the entire world. China's worldview is precisely what the world urgently needs to understand, because China has developed in a relatively closed manner for a long time. However, in the future, China's worldview may be even more worthy of in-depth recognition and understanding by the entire world than that of the United States. Alright, many thanks to Tsai Ching-yuan today. As Tsai Ching-yuan's last and only friend, no matter the circumstances, I always find a way to get him online every month. I always tell him, whether it's convenient for you or not, you have to show up online anyway. Every time I chat with Tsai Ching-yuan, I feel that I gain a lot. The inspiration brought by this kind of exchange is very important to me. At the same time, I also want to thank our audience friends Bartovk101 and Lu Juanzhong. Thank you both. I also want to thank you Mingwu. Thank you. In addition, thanks to the friend from the Super Combo. Here's a small token of appreciation for now. We'll chat in more detail later. Thanks to Wang Liang and Teacher Liang as well. Sincere thanks to all of you. Thanks to Jolin T, and also to Wang Leader. Wang Leader also asked another question. May I ask Dr. Tsai, what are your views on cross-strait relations? If the final outcome is inevitably toward unification, then between armed unification and peaceful unification, which model would best serve Trump's personal interests? Or, as Tang Jianglong said, the unification of the two sides is actually the greatest curse for Japan. Will Japan really mobilize the entire nation and fight desperately? What do you think about this issue? Japan is unlikely to fight desperately over this. At most, it will only cause China some minor trouble. However, in terms of the overall situation, maintaining the status of neither unification nor independence best serves Trump's greatest interests. Of course, whether the outcome is unification or independence, from Trump's perspective, he is always on the side of independence. Alright, let me get back to the topic of that book bag. When we were studying, we already understood that many politicians or countries, when facing complex situations, often adopt an ostrich mentality and shout a slogan, maintain the status quo. The so-called status quo means not disrupting the current situation across the Taiwan Strait. But you should also know that maintaining the status quo requires having sufficient strength as a precondition. Therefore, only those who possess real strength can say, I want to maintain the status quo. None of you should act rashly. Conversely, without strength, saying that you wish to maintain the status quo will only make you the object of others' ridicule. Everyone understands that it's nothing more than an ostrich mentality. When you don't know what to do, all you can say is, all right, then let's all stay still. But the question is, will anyone actually listen to you? Therefore, the United States is now using its remaining strength to once again call for maintaining the status quo. Although its strategy is gradually contracting, it must be admitted that this big brother's stamina is no longer what it used to be. I can no longer intervene in affairs in every corner of the world as I once did. In the past, whenever something anywhere conflicted with my values, I could swiftly deploy forces within 24 hours. Although I can't do it anymore, I still have to tell you, just because I need to go home for a nap first doesn't mean you can do whatever you want while I'm away. However, if the United States keeps calling to maintain the status quo at this point, does it still have any real effect? After all, any strategic report must be verified through concrete actions to prove its effectiveness. The joint patrols by China and Russia are precisely a test of whether the U.S. national security strategy is truly effective. Where exactly do you intend to draw this red line? Any strategic adjustment actually means a change in the position of the red line we are talking about. Therefore, in the face of the latest U.S. strategic report, everyone must figure out exactly where the new red line it sets is drawn. At the same time, countries such as China, Russia, the United States, and Japan are also reaffirming the positions of their future red lines. Similarly, once the red line is determined, all parties will begin to jockey for position around it. However, this red line has in fact already changed. The various disruptions appearing in the short term are actually only superficial because people have not yet figured out where the new red line is drawn. Alright, Next, we would like to thank Miranda Lee and Susan Sun for their support, and especially thank Dr. Tsai for presenting such a wonderful course. At the same time, we sincerely appreciate the participation of all our listeners and viewers. Most importantly, heartfelt thanks to Dr. Tsai Qingyuan for his dedicated monthly recordings and wonderful sharing on the program, Rongxing Tianxia. Every time Dr. Tsai Qingyuan is about to appear on the program, I know he has done a lot of preparation in advance. I'm truly very grateful to Qingyuan. Haha, you're too kind. Hope my appearance hasn't affected your ratings. Yes, sometimes I will definitely tell you. Alright, many thanks to Qingyuan, and I wish everyone a happy weekend. See you next time. Goodbye, and I wish everyone all the best.